and today we are going to paint a nice starry night sky scene. As per usual, all of the tools, materials, paints will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, you can also find the traceable up over on Patreon. With that said, let's jump into it. So we're going to begin here today by taking some Mars Black and a larger brush, and we're just going to give our canvas a thin layer of black paint. Now the brush size itself doesn't really matter all that much. This one is 3 inches wide though, and I like to use a flat-headed brush for this because it can just cover so much space so quickly. I'm also moving predominantly back and forth in X-shaped patterns because that's really going to give me a consistent application and ensure that there aren't really any thin areas. So I'm just going to continue applying this, and then at the end talk about what we do next. Now the entirety of the canvas has some black paint on it, and I'm now just working it back and forth until it gets to a point where it's almost dry. And in the process here, I'm trying to take out any notable streaks. So I initially applied it in an X-shaped pattern. Now I'm going back over it with a horizontal stroke, and I'm being very soft with my brush because the more pressure you put into it, the more of a streak and stroke you'll get. It's also worth noting that I want a thick enough application that you don't see any of the canvas showing through, but at the same time you don't want too thick of an application to the point where you build up any texture. So it's that sweet spot in the middle, and to get to this point I just recommend slowly applying black pigment to the canvas until you get the desired amount. I wouldn't go in with too much too quickly. So now we're done with this larger flat-headed brush. I'm going to go clean it thoroughly and just make sure none of this Mars Black pigment dries on the bristles because it'll really condense them and it'll make them quite hard. So we don't want that. Make sure that you do clean your brushes regularly and they will last a significantly longer time. So my canvas here is now fully dry to the touch and we can begin on the sky. And I'm going to do so with this flat-headed brush, but I'm first going to peel back a lot of the bristles so that it's very inconsistent, and so that when I make a tapping mark with it on the canvas, I'll have all of these small little impressions that will mimic that of stars. So this is actually a really quick and easy way to get a lot of detail on the canvas quite quickly. And here I have my palette. I have some new colors. Again, all of the colors will be listed in the video description, but I'm just going to take a little bit of titanium white, not much. I'm going to take a little bit of Mars Black, mix up a nice dark gray. I'll get a hint of blue, like that. And this right here will be brighter than the black, but only by a little bit. And then I'm going to go in and I'm just going to start tapping on all of these little implications. As you can see, I rotate my brush in between the taps, and this is going to give us a different impression each time. Now I'm going to start where I want the most lit area of the stars to be, and that'll be in a line working this way. And I think when a lot of people begin painting stars and clusters in space and all of that, they start with very bright, vibrant colors. But if you really want a lot of detail, if you really want a lot of depth, slowly build it up. Start with something not so bright like this, something that really isn't saturated, and build on top of it over time. That way you can make adjustments. That way underneath those very saturated and very sharp layers you can have this showing through, and it'll just make it significantly more complex and interesting. I'd also like to note that in the process here, if you grab a substantial amount of paint, all of your bristles will begin sticking together and you won't be able to make multiple small impressions. It'll start merging into a singular one. You don't want that, so if you find you have too much paint on your brush, just wipe it off on a painting cloth or a paper towel. You really want clean, small, sharp impressions to get these nice details in here. Now you can see that the edge here too got a little bit darker than the center area. That was intentional. I do want this area to be the brightest area of our stars. So even in the base layer, I'm starting those gradients, and they're not traditional gradients. Traditional gradients are one color to another, it's smooth, it's soft. This one, it is in this pattern of taps. So I'm also going back and I'm remixing a number of times, which I highly recommend. I don't generally like to mix a lot of pigment initially, just because I like having the opportunity to change it, to play with it, and to remix it. That way I remember how to mix it in future paintings. But here, as you can see, I start in the middle, and then I work my way up, I work my way down, and I connect it to our previous applications. Now, your pigments might be slightly different as you progress, as you continue to make those mixtures, and that's not a bad thing. Incorporating that diversity is actually quite good, and in those scenarios, I take some of that new pigment and I just work it into an older area. That way, they're connected, they're cohesive, and the painting works together as a whole. I'm also working until I almost essentially fully run out of pigment on my brush before I go and grab more, which is an unconventional way of painting. Generally, we don't like to do that because we don't like to have very thin paint or that gritty look, but that grit in this scenario actually looks quite nice. It looks like the impression of more stars, and we're not dragging the brush at any point. So it's much more controlled, and it's much more sharp. Now, we have this light area right here, but we need to work up, we need to work down, because we don't want any pure black showing. The black is good, it reminds us of space, but if we have something that's just a little bit brighter with just a little bit of color, it'll actually have a lot more depth and be significantly more interesting. So I'm going to pull the camera a little bit farther back, that way you can see all of it, and then we'll continue from there. Now, as I pull back, you'll probably recognize that the top right-hand corner here is actually a bit brighter than the top left-hand corner, simply because it's reflecting light. And that is an issue pure black can have on canvas. It can look significantly more reflective than other pigments, and that's another reason why we want to make this a little bit more gray and maybe even have a little bit of color. So we're going to continue with this. Here I have the pigment I've been using, and if I turn my palette, you can really see it. I'm going to make something a little bit darker than that. So we're just going to use a hint more titanium white than we did before. And I'm mixing it right beside that initial mixture, that way I have a good reference point, using my Cerulean blue right here. And that looks like it's a little bit brighter. So I'll get a bit more Mars black, just troubleshoot. Definitely darker now. We'll give this a shot. So you know what, I'll start tapping this at the top, at the bottom, just see what it looks like. I'm not using a large quantity, and I'm also not pressing my brush hard into the canvas. If you do, the bristles will flare out a little bit, and that can be an issue because as they flare, they make streaks, and we don't want streaks, we want taps. We want all of these little circular markings, not lines. With that said, as we continue, you can see that it actually is a bit darker than this area, which is great. I'll work a little bit of it back into the middle. That way, again, it's cohesive. We want everything to connect. But then I'll work it back up here. You also need to be cognizant of the fact that it can play tricks on you, initially at least, because acrylic paints are semi-reflective. When wet, especially, you may look at this new darker pigment and you say, oh, that's significantly brighter. It might not actually be. It might be that this lighter area has dried and therefore is no longer as reflective and therefore is no longer as bright. So it might also be worth it to apply a little bit of the darker pigment, let it dry for a little bit just to see what it actually turns into, what it actually looks like, and then progress from there. It's also worth noting that you could use a much larger brush if you wanted to speed this up, but I like having the control that the smaller brush affords. So now the entirety of the canvas has a layer, and we're going to head back in with a bit of a highlight. We're going to build on top of what we initially did while still allowing a little bit of this detail to show through. And I'm going to continue with this brush. You'll notice that it still has some pigment on it. I have been washing it as I've been going, that way that pigment doesn't dry. But when you do wash this, make sure that you dry it really, really well and then peel those bristles back out, because if it's wet, all of the bristles condense and you only get a single application rather than multiple. So just a quick little tip there. With that said, we're going to jump back into this. I'm going to take a little bit more of my Cerulean blue. I'm going to take a little bit of Mars black, a bit more titanium white than we've used before, and now I want to make something that's brighter than either of our previous applications, but not too bright. Again, we don't want to jump into anything too saturated or too bright too quickly. So here you can see it's significantly brighter than these. It's more saturated for sure, it has more blue in it, but it's still not a blue. Not a true vibrant blue. And that's great. This is what we want. So now we're going to go in to areas where we really want more highlight. And I'm going to, again, move a line across the sky. I'm going to make it slightly diagonal so that it's a bit more dynamic and interesting to the eye. And I'll occasionally move it up. I don't want it to be perfectly straight. So there you saw the dip up. Here you can see a dip down. Here you can see I'm still rotating my brush. But it's incredibly subtle. I'm also creating more of a hard line at the top, and then as you can see, I'm doing a bit of a movement downwards. It's not a blend, but again, it's a bit of a gradient through pattern. I'm going to try to make sure the edges aren't too bright, because I don't want the eye going over there, staying there, or being led off the canvas. Again, I want this area to be the brightest. So again, we're working up, I'm rotating my brush, I'm kind of creating this line initially, and then I'm going back under it once I run out of paint, and I'll just work down what little is left, making some areas, maybe here, go down a bit farther than others, and I'm trying to build in this nice inconsistency. You can see how the initial layer is still showing through in areas, and all of that detail, all of that time we put in, it is paying off, it is building, and it's creating this really, really beautiful subtle effect right now. I think a lot of beginners can make quite a pretty night sky, but there are a lot of little techniques that can make it something just so special if you're willing to put in that time. There we go. Now we'll grab a bit more of it and we'll create another highlighted area up here. Another little cluster. I've just about run out of paint, so I'll mix a bit more of it. I'm mixing on top, but I'm leaving a little bit of the side showing so I know exactly what I'm mixing towards. There we go. Looks nice. Can test it in here. Make sure it's what we want. Matches quite well. So now I'm heading back up. Create this slight, nice extension and highlight. It can kind of connect, but I don't want it too directly. I want it to be a bit more loose, and you can see how it has a zigzag motion. I'm really trying to be loose with it. But when you're being loose with your applications in paint, recognize that you're going to have subconscious tendencies. You're going to make the same mark to an extent a similar amount of times. And you'll think you're being random, but your motor skills, they'll kind of kick in and they'll make you do things repeatedly. So if you find that you're starting to get a similar look across multiple areas, move to a different area of the canvas. Work on something else for a second, just get a quick little restart. and then go back to what you were working on. So here you can see I've built in these new highlights, but I still want them to evolve. I want them to be interesting. So we'll work them out a little bit once our brush is almost out of paint. And this is going to be a fairly common way of going about this. We apply highlights where we want, and then when we have almost no additional paint, we just build it out. And it creates a little bit of a glow to the clusters. Makes them feel like they're shining. It's not just a little patch of light, it's light and then light emanating from that light. And that's really what sells it and makes it interesting. See that? Now I'm looking at the camera. I've been painting this portion for about 5 minutes. And that's probably getting a little risky with my brush and the paint that's on there drying. So I'm going to apply just a little bit more. And then right after this, I'm going to wash my brush well, and then I'm going to dry it really well. That way we can come back in. Each time we do one of these layers, we want the previous one to be dry. So this is actually good. It's going to give us an opportunity to kind of let all of that new detail dry. And then when we come back into it, we'll be ready with a new brush and the perfect base. And just for knowledge's sake, the reason you want the base layer to be dry is just so you're not constantly moving this pigment and so that you have detail work underneath. But if those layers were still wet and we went over them again, we'd probably start blending paint, it would start mixing, it would probably get softer, and you wouldn't have those nice sharp applications that you want for your distant stars. So I think we'll now wash this and be right back. So it's been a little while. I cleaned my brush, it got fully wet, now it is fully dry, and in the process, the bristles condensed because they did get wet, so yet again, we just need to peel these back, apply a little bit of a pressure, and get something nice and inconsistent. This is also great because every time we wash it and do this, our bristles are going to end up different from the last time, and if there were any particular patterns it was creating, it will no longer do so, and we won't have to worry about different elements of the painting looking kind of samey. So with that, I now have my brush, I'm ready for the next layer, and for this one I think we'll get significantly closer, that way you can see the real detail work. So we're now quite close to the canvas, and as you can see there is a lot of notable detail there that you might not see from a distance. And that's really one of the wonderful things I think about painting is, you get this initial response to it probably from an afar, and in that you get the general feeling and the emotion, the mood of the painting. And then as you get closer, you just pick up on all of these details. It continues to tell a more elaborate story, and there are just all of these subtleties, if done right, that you can pick up on. I love that. But that is a talk on painting as a whole. Right now, we are talking about stars, which, yet again, we're going to make brighter. So we'll take some additional titanium white, additional blue. We're mixing this right beside our last mixture. A little bit of Mars black, not much. Every time we're using less and less Mars black, and we're building a slightly brighter, slightly more saturated pigment. And this, as you can see, definitely brighter. Still not a blue. We'll add a little bit more blue to it, but I don't want it to be saturated at this point. We're still building this up slowly over time. So, getting back into this, I'm finding the initial main line I created. I'm applying it. I'm rotating my brush. I'm following that line. See that? Just building up. And I'm starting to diversify. There's this patch right here that had a little bit of highlight. I liked it a lot, so here I'm building on it. You can see it's detached from the main line, but that's okay. It's really interesting. And I'm starting to run out of pigment, as you can tell up here. It's no longer as bright or as opaque. So, now that I am starting to run out, I'm going back over that line, just underneath it, and I'm working it down. That way it's a bit more full, it's a bit brighter, it again feels like the light is working its way out. It's more elaborate. But I'm still leaving small little gaps and darker areas and openings, trying to keep it as natural as possible. And that means avoiding pure consistency. Even now, you can still see little bits of paint coming off and it brightening these areas. It might look a little bit too contrast heavy right now with this and this, but don't worry, we will go back and we will balance it. This is all part of the process. You can really bring this down as far as you want because we'll be painting the land and the clouds over top of this. So I'm just making sure the bottom area has a little bit of something. And at this point, because there's so little paint left on the brush, the applications are almost fully transparent, and it actually looks a lot like the initial applications we made. Grab a bit more though. Apply that up top, make sure we don't have much pigment, and then we can come back down into these areas and fill them out. Let's go back to this though. I like that a lot and I want a bit more. So we'll grab some extra titanium white, some extra blue, extra Mars black. Try to mix up something very similar, if not the same. There we go. And just like that. Really, really pretty. Add a little bit down here just in case it is slightly different. Still want it to be cohesive. And remember, this edge and this edge, slightly darker than this middle area. I think we'll also add a little bit of a highlight up here, but I'll move the camera back so you can really see what we're doing. So we have a lot of highlight and detail down at the bottom half, but not much at the top, and it almost feels like there's a dividing line with the sky. So I want a little bit of highlight up here as well to kind of bridge these two pieces and make the sky feel like it's one cohesive whole. Generally when you're doing a subject, whether it be a landmass or a sky, you don't want something directly in the middle cutting it in half. You want subjects that are going to lead you from one half to the other and keep it visually moving. So that's what this is intended to do. It's significantly more subtle than this or this. The value is definitely darker, but it's going to do the job. It's going to bring the eye from one area to the next, and it's going to feel nice and cohesive. Then I'm just lightly combining the top and the bottom here, with all of these little taps. I'm bouncing around because again, we are slightly changing our pigment. Not necessarily intentionally, but every time you mix your pigment, it'll probably be just a tiny bit different. And it's better to be safe than sorry. There we go. Now we have a lot of movement through here, which I like, but this area, again, a little bit darker. So let's add a bit more up there. My pigment's almost dry here on the palette, so it's not going to be too notable here on the canvas, as you can see, so I don't have to start by applying that initial pigment in the center. I can just kind of jump up here. And I'm going to connect it through here and then up. You can definitely make skies significantly more quickly than this. But again, if you want full control, or at least a lot of control, and you want to make sure that it's truly balanced, going through these different layers and steps will just, it'll really get you there. Need a bit more pigment, white, blue, black. Good. We'll test it down here. It's nice and bright. Also glad I did test it down here because the brush currently has quite a bit of it, and I wouldn't want to just apply that right up there. This is where I want my highlights. It's really turning out beautiful though. Better than expected. Love when this happens. You know, I actually don't think I've put this much time into stars in a sky of this size before. And that's probably why it looks so good. Oh, I love that. Okay, so heading back up here now that we don't have much pigment left on our brush. This is what we actually came back in here for. Build out this area a little bit. Just so easy to get distracted when you're working with such nice pigments. There we go. And again, look at our palette. Look at the pigments we've used here. None of which are saturated, none of which are truly bright. And that's just to show you subtlety really can be a brilliant thing in your paintings. You don't need to start with a hyper saturated, bright star. I actually find that the more I paint, the longer I do this, the more I appreciate the slightly more gray colors. The slightly less hyper bright or hyper dark, everything kind of in the middle that's really beautiful. Also, I say that I just messed up. I applied this to the top with the clean pigment, so it's quite vibrant. So I'm just taking some of that pigment off right down here again, yet again. And now I feel like I don't have much, so we'll head back up. That's more soft, value-wise, saturation-wise. It's more transparent, it's less opaque. So it's great to work back up in there. And then remember to work it out. Now we're going to head right back into those stars now that they've dried with our clean brush. Remember, we start things off by just peeling these back. And now we're going to add what may be our final highlight before our next step. And for this, yet again, we're working with blue initially. We will be using our red in just a second, but I'm mixing up the lightest blue we've used thus far. Still using a hint of Mars Black, but there you can see I tried my initial mixture. It's really quite close to the one we used last time, so we don't want that. We do want something a bit brighter. So we'll build that up, and you know what? I think that right there is a good color. So we'll pick a couple areas that we really want this to stand out. And it's also important to recognize that this looks relatively bright here. It'll probably look less bright right there, and you can tell that it does because acrylic paints are semi-transparent. You can generally see through them to a point, and that black or that darker gray is showing through on our canvas, making the pigment look and be a little bit darker, where on our palette it doesn't have that dark base to kind of bring it down in value. So just recognize that the color that you mix on your palette isn't always going to be the color you get on your canvas, and you might want to adjust a little bit. With that, it's a really nice bright start. I still have some pigment on my brush. I'll move that up here. Yet again, I'll move it down and out in those same ways. Just make sure we get a consistent movement of it, because we don't want it to be just a streak in the sky. We want it to be affecting all of the areas surrounding it. I also think that skies like this generally look a little bit better when it isn't just an incredibly bright area in one spot. when it does move out and it can kind of fill a large portion, it just seems so much better. So that's what we're doing here. And I think the more and more you see, the more and more you'll like it. This is where it really starts to come together. There we go. Now grab a little bit more, head back up into this, there, and then we'll blend that out a little bit on all sides, but I still want this area to be darker than this area. So I have to be a little bit careful. Remember, the more you let your brush run out of pigment, the more careful you can be. Now we're going to grab some of our red, like that. This is just cadmium red light hue. Grab a little bit of titanium white. Grab a hint of Mars black. Create this nice dark grayish pinkish red pigment. Starting with something that isn't too bright, and it needs to look similar to that value-wise, saturation-wise as well. And I think we actually found something that worked really nicely. And then I'll find some areas in here, particularly in the brighter zones, that could use a bit of color diversity. And I'll start working this in. See, I skipped an area there. Jumping around quite a bit. We'll incorporate some up here, maybe quite a bit. And you can even build out whole new areas to have this color that didn't have a lot of light before. And this is going to add a lot of color depth to the painting. Before it was really quite gray and blue, and now intermixed we'll have this really beautiful pigment. You could go with something a bit more pink. I think that's more of a general choice, but I personally like that it has a bit more of a red to it. We'll see how it progresses though. I always like to have an idea of what I'm doing, but I also like to change things and just kind of work with the painting in the way it wants to go. While we're working on things, we get new ideas, new opportunities present themselves, and it's important to recognize that you can be flexible if you want to be. If you feel like the painting will be better for it. Here you can see I'm working over most of the blue, but I'm doing it very, very softly with a very minimal amount of paint. Trying to get a very subtle blend. And I'm just going to work this all the way through the bottom here and a little bit up, and then I will see you when I'm done. So here's a bit of a wide shot, and as you can see, it's really progressing. The two pigments mix quite well together when they're subtle, and I actually went back with a little bit of that blue highlight over some of the areas that I added maybe a little bit too much red, so you can always work it back and rebalance the two. But with that, I do want to come back into this area with a bit more highlight. It's time to continue building, so here, more titanium white, a bit more blue. It's very saturated, very bright, a little hint of black. But we want this to be the brightest blue and maybe even edging towards white than we've used before. Showing it to you at a distance, that way you can kind of see it in contrast with all of the other colors on our palette, but also the other colors on our canvas. So you can see that this is really quite bright. And I'll apply this along that line we've been working towards this whole time. And this will be that real light. Really beautiful, really notable. I'm applying it very slowly, very subtly. It's a very powerful pigment because it's just such a bright value in comparison to everything else. So it's imperative that you really take good care with these applications, that you're cognizant of what you're doing, why you're doing it. I'm skipping some areas here and there. I'm using a very soft tap of my brush to give me the most small markings. The harder you push with your brush, the larger the applications you'll get, because those bristles will condense, they'll push that paint around, and you don't want that. You just want the paint to transfer from brush, from bristle, to canvas. So we're just being incredibly subtle here. Occasionally I'm applying a little area that's a bit farther out. And then, as always, as we start to run out of pigment, I do work it down, but not to that same extent. I want this to really stand out, and if we kind of extended it in all directions, then everything else would start getting this light value, and I don't want that. I just want there to be a slight extension of this. So you can see that I'm not dragging it down over here, I'm just dragging it down maybe half an inch to an inch. I'm creating this really notable area. Take a little break there, start it up again over here. But again, the edge isn't as bright. And I'm doing a couple little taps elsewhere just to give me a bit more diversity, to bring the eye up into the top, because remember, we don't want to separate the bottom half from the top half. We want them to work together in conjunction. So I'm applying little bits of it at the top. Not too much though, and I'm not letting it kind of blend out to that same extent. Now right there, I applied significantly more than I wanted to. I'm going to try to take that off with my brush, my hand, just a little swipe, and we were able to save it. There we go. Let's move you in a little bit closer and continue. So here we are yet again. Just making that highlight slightly brighter than what it was before. Going to that top area. Creating this very definitive line in there. But making that line moving, playful, dancing a little bit. The more time you put into this, the better it will look. The more layers, the more subtle, small applications, and that's just what we're doing. Okay, now from there, we're going to continue making this interesting by adding in a brighter pink. So now we're looking for something on this level of brightness. So we grab our red, we grab some white, mix those two together. It's a similar brightness, but it's a little too saturated, so I'm grabbing a hint of Mars Black, which will darken it. So I'll add more titanium white. That titanium white and Mars Black will make more of a gray, which gives us something of an equal brightness to what we had before, but less saturation. See that? We'll just find some areas to work in this really nice pinkish red. You can see it's very subtle right now. It's because the value is so similar to what we have. Value in art, of course, just saying how bright or dark a color is. If it has a dark value, it's a dark color. If it has a light value, it's a light color. So despite these being different colors, the blue and the pink, they can still have the same value. They can still be the same level of bright / darkness. There we go. And again, this is where the magic happens. I've done a number of 10-minute space paintings, and you can do something like this in 10 minutes. You really can, but it won't be this detailed, it won't be this meticulous, and it won't be this special. There's a reason this video is going to be as long as it is. It's because for those of you who really want to put a lot of time and care into this, you know exactly how to do it and how to make it its best version of itself. There we go. Thank you for watching, by the way. Thank you for taking the time to watch these longer videos. You know, I love being able to teach people how to do what they want to do and how to create what they want to create. And you know, by watching this, by liking the videos, by sharing the videos, you provide me the platform to do that. That's a really special thing, and I really do appreciate that. So thank you. Thank you for leaving the comments. Thank you for liking the videos. Thank you for sharing these with your friends. All of that, it helps immensely. There we go. Getting to the point where it's starting to look like it's almost glowing. Brush has a little bit of red on it right now, a little bit of blue. It's got a nice mix. Next, I'm going to be using this small round-headed brush. It is about 1/8 of an inch. It's quite tiny, but it's great for the next effect we're about to create, which is a myriad of stars in the sky. So I'm going to begin here by taking that small brush, adding quite a bit of water to it, wiping off a little bit of that excess along the side of my dish, taking some titanium white pigment, take that from there, move it there. We'll grab more water and thin out that titanium white until it's almost like a watercolor and it's just dripping here on the palette. And then we'll use this on our canvas. So now we're going to take our brush, we're going to put it on the same angle as this right here. We're going to peel back our bristles and we're going to launch all of these stars at the canvas. You saw just how quickly how many of those were applied to the canvas. The closer you get, the more you'll be able to make them directional. And by applying it in a certain direction, you can actually get a bit of specific work in there. If you kind of move your brush all the way around like that, you can get it to a wide effect, but if you get close and you make sure the brush is on an angle, you can actually work in specific lines. And I'm going to try to make sure this area right here is the most starry. So I'm continuously grabbing a little bit more paint and a little bit more water, and I'm just going back over this area. And I'm probably going to do this 10, 15 times, but it's such a quick and easy way to just get a myriad of stars there on the canvas. They're also so small that we really couldn't achieve these with a regular brush, with a tap or anything of that nature. So we're creating a lot of intricate detail that just wouldn't be achievable in any other way. And again, it is something you can kind of put everywhere, but it's also something you can get quite skilled with and apply to very specific areas. I would warn you to perhaps again put something maybe behind the canvas, otherwise you will get a little bit of this white pigment on your things, but I've done this so many times I'm not too worried about it anymore. You can see how it's just slowly adding up though. And occasionally I will do a farther one, get more of the top of the canvas. Starting to run out of water and paint. So, you know what, I'll probably just mix a little bit more, grab a little bit more water, and there you go. Significantly more. Now this next step here, it's pretty important. And what we're going to do, we're going to make the horizon here, where the land meets the sky, a little bit brighter. Almost to the point where it's at this value. So I'll have this slightly darker area right in here, maybe right over here, but I want this to be relatively bright. That way we can add some dark clouds on top of it, and that way the land masses can be distinctive. So what I'll do is I'll take a little bit of my titanium white, a little bit of my Mars black, and I want to mix up a color that's fairly similar to what we have right there. That's probably a little bit too dark. Add a bit more titanium white, just troubleshoot a little bit, make it a bit more blue. I'll test it up here, and I'll see that, you know what, that is quite bright. It looks like it's natural in those settings. So I'll try it down here. And as you can see, it is brighter. And I'll start with a little bit of a tap, but then I'll eventually, once I have a little bit of it on and it's still wet, I'll move my brush around in little circles, like that. My brush isn't leaving the canvas. It's just creating this very soft, semi-transparent application. And it's a mix of the texture that we have up there, but also a softer one. You can still see some of the stars through it. And I'm just running this across my horizon. It's very, very soft. There's almost no pressure here. If you started to add pressure, you'd get a lot of streaks. And we don't want that. There you can see it connects and it's a pretty similar value. This will look really, really nice in just a minute. And I can even blend it up into here and have it connect. Make it very cohesive. So that step is now done, and we're going to switch to another 1/2 inch flat-headed brush. This is just like the other one, except I haven't peeled back the bristles. I want them to be nice and tight together. And with this, I'm going to add a little bit of water, wipe it off, that way it's damp and the bristles condense. Then I'm going to take a bit of Mars black, and I'm going to mix up one of the darkest pigments we've mixed. So I'll work on top of my previously darkest pigment, grab a little bit of titanium white, grab a little bit of our blue, a little bit more. That looks quite dark. And then I'll start creating some clouds. So I'm working horizontally, and then I'll move back this way. Working horizontally, I'll move back this way. These will be nice and distinct now that we have that brighter highlight underneath. Be able to get some good details. Now as I start to run out of pigment, you'll see that it's very transparent, and that's because the brush is damp. The water's still in the brush, so even when we don't have pigment, we'll still get a little bit of a wash there, which is nice. And I'm just kind of sketching out my clouds. Here's a bit of a closer look, and again, we'll take a bit of extra Mars black, titanium white, a bit more Mars black. If you feel like you had too much titanium white, don't feel like you need to use that initial mixture, go back, remix, grab a little bit more blue, and working back into this cloud again. Now, what happened is we applied that pigment, and then the sun came out. And it made all of this wet pigment very reflective, so you can't really see that cloud right now, because it's making that darker value look brighter. It's not, and it'll look darker when it dries, but because it's wet, it's reflecting that light. So we need to make sure that we don't accidentally go too dark with these clouds. But here you can see I'm still just working this across, making little ones, making more non-transparent ones. I'm trying to also move around a lot. So you see how high this is, and then it dips, and then it dips, and then it dips. It's kind of creating stairs, but then you know what, maybe I'll come back up a little bit. Really trying to get a lot of diversity. I also want the edges of my clouds to taper and become slightly less opaque. So I'm applying less pressure there, and I might go back to them when I start to run out of pigment on my brush. That way I get that semi-transparent edge, and it just kind of drifts off. Remember, if you're having issues with drawing the clouds, you can always just use the traceable up over on Patreon. So now we're going to jump back into this, again using that same 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and I've applied a little bit of sap green here to my palette, and we'll use that as we get closer into the foreground. But in the background we're going to have a lot of fog, a lot of reflective light, and that means this pigment is going to carry its way through into the backing land. So here I have my color for the clouds, which is also useful because we want this to be incorporated. So I'm going to start with a little bit of blue because that's what we used in there. I'll grab a little bit of white because we know it's not a pure black or dark pigment. We'll grab some black, and we want to mix something that's a little bit darker than this, but quite similar. So I'll add a bit more blue, and we'll give this a go. I'm going to apply it to the landmass right back here. I like this brush because it has a nice sharp edge for these areas. And I think that actually blends really, really nice into that area. We'll do a bit more of it over here. This will go up either through or in front of the clouds. It's up to you, depending upon where you want it depth-wise. And then I'll start blending this forward in the painting. My brush is a little bit damp, so I'm able to get a nice gradient from pure pigment into not pigment. And then as we get closer, we'll make it a little bit darker. So I'll grab some extra Mars black, work that in there, and I'll work on my next little set of mountains right here. Again, I start on the edge because that's when I have the most sharp pigment and the best chance at a clean application. And then I'll work my way down in a bit of a blend. And we want to cover just about everything here. We don't want anything to remain that pure Mars black that we used as the base layer. Now I'm going to mix up a bit more of that pigment. Mars black, blue, a little bit of white. Come over here and create our next little piece of land. And this is going to work its way from the top of our landmass right here, back down, and then into the distant mountains. So I want a subtle blend from this into that lighter blue. There we go. That backing blue is still wet, so it was quite easy to make that transition. Now, as you move down, you have a couple of options. You can either make it get brighter, and that would mean the bottom area would have quite a bit of mist, or you can make it darker, and that just means that we're getting farther away from the light and it's getting darker. I think what I'm going to do here is opt to make it a little bit darker, and then if I want the mist, I'll add it in later. So I'm grabbing a bit of extra Mars Black, applying that to the bottom, and then working my way up. But you can see that this and this are still different. I'm not using a pure Mars Black here. It has a bit more depth than that. I'll also throw it on the other side and work it up. Remember, the light's coming from up here, so the farther down we get, the more shadows are cast and the darker it's going to get. So you want the tops of these to be the brightest. Now I'm going to add a little bit more water to my brush, wipe off the excess, head over to my palette, and this time I'm going to take a bit of sap green and work that into our mixture. Just like that. Might also add a hint of titanium white. Give us a nice, very desaturated, soft green. And I'll apply this to the top of this landmass, and I'll work it around our walkway here. I'll do this on both sides. Connect it into what we have here moving back. There we go. Remember that the almost black or the true black is going to show through. So this will be a bit darker than what you had on your palette. And that's okay. As we get closer to the foreground, we're going to make it a bit darker because it will have a slope, it will descend, and we want that transition. The more quickly you work, the more of a subtle, soft blend you'll naturally get, because the pigments will still be wet and they'll be able to work together. But if you don't get it too quickly, don't worry, you can always go back, reapply this pigment, and just work that way. I'll probably have to go back and do another layer, but that's okay. I also don't want too hard of an edge here, so I'm going to go and I'll soften this a little bit. There we go. I think I'll mix up a bit more of that brighter, more green version, and I'll add to the highlights of the top. And I'll also create some interesting divots as it moves down. You see how it barely looks like a green right now? That's exactly what we want. Here I'm going back to some previously applied areas and just adding a bit more to them, slowly building it up in the same way we did the sky. Still leaving darker areas in there though. And I'm trying to make sure this isn't a flat line on either side. I want it to have divots, areas that stick out. So here I'm just incorporating a bit more of a sporadic edge. And then of course we have more right here. So we'll go back in and touch that up. Working my way from the top, doing some little strokes, and it's okay if you have some strokes showing through. It'll look like areas of land are raised and they're catching a bit more light. So here we are with the base layer, and as you can tell, that middle area closest to the path is the brightest. The area closest to us is a little bit brighter than what we have in the back. And this area, while it's a brighter green than what we have here, it's not as bright as what we have up there. And we want to build this up just a little bit more so that these values match that of these, if not being a little bit brighter, but we don't want this to be as bright as the light up there. So we're going to continue taking more of that green, a bit more titanium white than what we used before, a little bit of Mars black. We'll mix these together, and once we have something consistent, we'll apply that to the edges, like so. And then we'll work it down. And I'm doing it on the same angle as the actual mountain. And as you can see, as I run out of paint, I work it farther and farther back until we get to that edge. I'll work a little bit down that edge, and then I'll work my way back through here. Now my brush is a little bit damp right now, which is allowing me to work wet onto dry, which just means that we're applying wet pigment onto dry pigment, but I'm getting a relatively smooth looking application because the pigment's semi-transparent, and I'm just moving this new layer on top of the previous layer. It's not blending, it's not mixing, but it visually is, because now we have a more opaque amount up here. It becomes more transparent, and as it becomes more transparent, that darker pigment shows through. There we go. We can incorporate a bit of it back here, have it laid back up, move it down. Much like the sky and the stars, it's a layering process, and the best job, the best look will occur when you take your time and you build it up over time. So that's what we're doing. Not rushing it, just doing our best. Now we're going to take that older flat-headed brush, grab a little bit of our green, some titanium white, and some Mars black. And with this mixture, I want it to be just a hint brighter than the brightest green we've made thus far. So here, you can see it's coming along quite well. Still pretty gray, not close to how saturated that is, but I'm going to take this, and you can have a couple of different options here. You can move it up with a little bit of a wisp to create some grass here in the foreground, or you can do a little bit of a tap to show a lower grass. So really, it depends on what you want to do here, what your desired effect is, and I'll show you both. So I can go up, a little bit of a wisp, and you can see these little patches of grass here. On this side, you can do a little bit of a tap, create much shorter grass, and it might be a little bit of a tap and drag, so you're just tapping and you're dragging that down, creating a very soft, subtle look. So you have a couple of options right here. I'm personally going to opt for this one, and then as I get farther away, I'll do more of this, so it looks like this taller grass is still moving along, but it's getting smaller and smaller, not physically, but via perspective. So I'm going to continue with that. I'll make it a bit more stark. So add in a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more of our green. And I'll just make some strokes that go to the left, to the right. I'm predominantly only going to be applying this right along the edges of our pathway here. Like that. Still rotating my brush. And as I'm getting farther away, my strokes are getting shorter and shorter. And now I am a bit farther away, so it's just a tap. Here's a shot of it from the distance, so you can see the contrast in value between this area and the sky up there. I'm also going to have this kind of running down and off the hill. So as I get farther away from the path, yet again my strokes get shorter. I apply almost no pressure, it dissipates, becomes almost clear, and we want it to get smaller and smaller as we move to the right as well as forward, because as we move to the right, we're moving down a hill, we're moving farther away, just like we are here. So perspective, yet again, is going to make it look smaller and smaller. And what's great about this is it's going to give us a lot of pattern down in the grass. So it'll complement what we have up here quite well. If we just had those large brush strokes from our previous applications, this area wouldn't look like it was painted in the same way as the top of the painting. It wouldn't really mesh. So going back and doing this can really bring the piece together. There we go. We'll mix up a bit more. Keep some of it on the side so you know what you're mixing to. You have a reference point. A little bit too gray. Add some extra green. Head over here. And just start creating again. We're very close to the path, so my strokes are long, but still incredibly soft. You can see just how much grass this renders and how quickly it does it. Getting farther away, strokes are getting smaller. And now, as we run out of paint, we're moving more to the left, as well as farther away. Now, in the background here, things are going to get a little bit more complicated because, again, right now, they just look like larger brush strokes, where this is a lot of meticulous detail, this is a lot of meticulous detail, and the styles, they don't really mesh. So what we're going to do a little bit of a tap with that highlight, very, very softly when we have almost none on our brush. We're starting at the top, we're working our way down to the bottom, and then I'll just take my finger and I'll soften it very, very slightly. This way it has a hint of detail, but that detail is substantially less than what we have here in the foreground. So it won't pop to the same extent, it will look farther away, but it will still look like it matches and exists properly in the same world. If you make your finger a little bit damp before you start, that can also aid you in the process. For additional really sharp detail here in the grass in the foreground, you can take a smaller flat-headed brush. This one is about 1/4 inch. Make sure it's nice and damp. Then take a bit more of that highlight, maybe even a slightly brighter variant. So I'm mixing right on top just to see what I end up with. Add a bit of extra titanium white. I think that's really good. There you can see it without any glare. And I'll go in and I'll just incorporate a couple very particular strokes. You can use this to add highlight to pre-existing blades, but there I added a bit too much pressure. You see that that stroke got large quickly. I'm going to try to taper the top a little bit, add a little bit more water to my brush, grab a little bit more pigment. There we go. Making it nice and sharp again. The less pressure you add, remember, the less large of a stroke you'll create. So here's a bit of a wide shot, just showing you again how the grass looks with the highlights and how all of those details are really starting to mesh and make it feel like a very complete, cohesive piece. With that, next we are going to jump right down into here and continue. So here we are back up close, and we're going to start using our smaller flat-headed brush for some wooden boards right down here. Again, this one is about 1/4 inch, and I've also added a bit of burnt umber here to my palette. So we're going to begin by taking some of that burnt umber, finding a nice, relatively clean spot on our palette. We'll grab some titanium white and quite a bit of Mars black. We want this to be quite dark, as it's going to be our base layer. We want it to be fairly desaturated, and then much like everything else, we will build on top of it. But I'm looking for something that is brown, that is dark, that is gray. And I'm going to apply this with these horizontal strokes, as you can see. I'm going to use the edge of my brush to cut really sharp lines against the grass. And you can have some areas that are semi-transparent and show through a little bit. That way you have different opacities. You have some that's more brown, some that's a little bit darker, and almost black. And things are about to get really, really interesting here in a second. Now I'm going to head back to my palette, grab a significant amount of that paint. And you see how these two are kind of connected? I'm going to make one right here, and there's a break. So you see how it goes that way, it goes in, and then it goes that way again? That means that this is a step. That means that you walk on this and then you take a step down. It's going to create some extra depth and make the piece significantly more interesting. If you are just a beginner and you're new to this, then you could do this without any steps and just have a continuous line. But if you want a little bit of a challenge and some extra depth in the painting, just follow the following instructions. So there we have our first couple sets. I'm now making my brush a little bit damp to again condense the bristles and allow me to continue making those nice sharp edges. Then I'll mix up more of that dark pigment. There we go, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit more Mars black, a little bit more brown, lots of problem solving. And here, I'm going to make an application that is moving straight up. So here you see it's not continuing the slant, it's moving upwards. We'll do the same over here, and then we'll connect. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a slant, like that, and then I'll connect. Now I'm going straight up on the other side, connect. And I'm building stairs right here. They're subtle because they're a little bit farther away at this point. But again, I'm going back and forth between straight up and then a little bit of a slant. And you want your brush to be nice and damp for this, that way your applications are sharp. There we go. Of course, the drawback to having a damp brush is that sometimes your applications will be a little bit thin, but that's okay, we can always go back over it. And we've done a fair number of these now. We can continue that in a little bit, but I would like to talk about our next step with this. So we're going to get a little bit closer and make this a bit more three-dimensional. So here we are quite close, and now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take some brown, take some white, and a little bit less black than what we were using, and I'm going to mix up a bit of a brighter brown. I'm mixing it right beside our initial brown here, that way I have a good reference, and I don't want it to be significantly brighter. This is a lot like mixing our sky and our stars. You want it to work in very small, slow intervals. So there we have something that's a bit brighter. I like that a lot, actually. And I'm going to ask myself which of these are going to be straight up and which of them are dips, because the ones that are straight up are going to get some of this application. And I'm going to initially use the smaller edge of the brush and work in a little bit of wood grain, a little bit of moving, pieces like that. Lots of line work. I say, you know what, these ones down here are the same. So I'll incorporate some of this. And right now this looks rather saturated and bright. As it dries, it will look darker and it won't look as poppy as it currently is, so don't worry about that. But now here's where it gets interesting, because now we're at the stairs. So we have this area right here, it's facing us, which means it's facing away from that light area. So we're only going to apply this to the top of the step, which means the area that's vertical here that we did, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do the area that's horizontal. Or not horizontal, but diagonal. There we go. Now here we have that vertical piece. We skip it. And we apply this right there. Again, we skip the next area. And each time we do this, we want it to get smaller and smaller because perspective is going to make it look so. And just like that, we have some steps, which are quite fun, but we're going to continue elaborating on this area by mixing a little bit of a darker mixture than what we've used before. So I'll take some Mars Black, I'll work that into our previous dark mixture right there. You can see the contrast of those two. And I'll create some separation in my boards down here. Extra little detail. Just like that. You can also work some of that into the base of the darker areas of these steps, give it a little bit of depth. The light can kind of run down it, just a hint. But it's very soft, and once you start to run out of pigment, you can even work a little bit of this into those highlighted areas. That way they have a bit of visual movement. They feel like they have some depth in the wood. There, I'll add a little crack on the side of this. Works its way in, really quite nice. And again, it's all still a little bit wet, so it's a bit more saturated looking than it will be when it finishes. Now as we get farther away, remember we're going to have less detail, and we need to pick up with the darker pigment that we used for the base layer, not the new highlighted pigment. So I have that again right there. I'll mix more of that pigment right beside it using that initial mixture as a reference. Significantly too bright. Get some extra Mars Black. There we go. And we'll just work this in the back. I'm still using horizontal strokes, but at this point we're getting farther and farther away, and we won't be able to see any detail back here. So now I'm going in the same angle as the path with my brush, just because I wouldn't be able to get that small sharp impression moving horizontally. I'm now just using the corner of my brush for those very tight details back here. And we'll lead it to the peak. Then, grab a bit more highlight. Continue our stairs, and then at the top here, I think this will be consistent. So I'm just doing lots of little horizontal strokes. That way it looks like we have multiple boards like we do here at the same height. But there we go. If you want, you can go back into these with an even brighter version. So I'll just take some extra titanium white, work that in. There you can see the saturation of it. I think I'll bump it up just a hint. I like that a lot. You can come back into this, and this is where you can incorporate a lot of really sharp detail. So I'm going to do a little bit of a tap. Because this wood board is so close to us, you'll see all of the nooks and crannies, all of the miniature little imperfections that make it just so beautiful and natural. And here you might want to go in with a dry brush, because if you get a little bit of that canvas grain, it'll look like a nice texture on the wood. And you can see how this value matches this quite well. There we go. If you make it too dark, or rather too light, you can always just go back over it. It's not a large area. It's quite easy to fix. There we go. Then we can continue moving back, but as you do, apply less and less and allow it to be more and more transparent, because you won't see that much detail even at this distance. So it needs to change rather quickly. So as I take a step back, I absolutely love all of the highlights and the detail, the depth that we got in there, but I realized something I really want to fix, and that is these clouds in the distance. I feel like we may have made them a hint too dark, and so I'm going to go back in, I'm going to play with those, and I'm going to do so with the smaller round-headed brush again. Remember, this one is about 1/8 of an inch, and I like it because it doesn't have any hard edges, so it's great for rendering softer subjects like clouds, mist, fog, all of that. Now, I'm going to begin by mixing a pigment that's fairly similar to this, but maybe just a little bit lighter. So if I remember correctly, we had quite a bit of blue, we had a bit of Mars black, some titanium white, and I think that's a good start right there. So I'll head back in, and I'll start applying this. Now, as you can see, it's a little bit more blue than what we had before, and value-wise, in regards to how dark or bright it is, it's a little bit, it's interesting. The pigment itself is brighter than what we have on the edges, but because it's over the dark background and it's not very thick, it's darker. So it's kind of a tricky situation. I think what we'll do, I'll get you much closer and we'll continue working on this together, but this will be fun. I like this. So here we are, and as you can see, this is slightly darker than the surrounding areas. What we're going to do though, I think I might keep this for the edges and the tops of our clouds, and I'll make the bottoms a little bit darker. So here we have our mixture. I'll just grab a bit more of that. I'll apply it to the top of our cloud right here. My brush is a little bit damp, so I'm able to blend a little bit softly here over our pre-existing drier pigments. And then I'll just slowly blend it down, as you can see. This way, the top is brighter, the bottom is darker. It looks like the top of the cloud is receiving a little bit of extra light. Get some blue, get some white, get some Mars black, mix up more of that nice bluish gray. Apply that to the top. And here you can see this value is brighter than that of the surrounding area. So we're just slowly building it up, and we'll have a lot of extra depth in these clouds now, because they'll range from a light value on top to a darker value underneath. And that's really how you create depth in any subject. You wrap light around it. You make some areas brighter than others. And here, while I'm running out of paint, I'm just moving a slight amount of this pigment down over the darker area. That way it isn't as dark as it was, which was my initial issue with it. Now down here has a little bit of a protruding area, so I'll grab some more pigment. Work that on top. Just like that. Wetting my brush. Mixing more of that paint. Continuously mixing it, just to build the habit to get better at mixing, matching colors. There we go. Just applying this to the tops of all of these small little clouds. Softening it a little bit with my hand there. Oh, that's pretty. It's really, really pretty. And of course, if you make any area too bright, you can just go over it with a slightly darker pigment. So there we have the updated version of the clouds, and I have to say, I feel like they look a whole lot better. They have significantly more depth. They look like they're a bit more complicated than they were, but at the same time are also significantly more subtle than they were. I love that we took that contrast out of the background because it makes the foreground here and the stars just look so much more dominant. So that's also a good reminder. If you have high contrast areas in every area of your painting, the viewer eye, it's not really going to know where to go. If you save it for some special areas, some specific subjects, then the eye will be attracted to that area, it will stay there, and you'll have those very visually popping areas in your painting that I think we all really work hard to get to. So just a little tip there. With that, I still have quite a bit I'd like to do with this painting. The next thing we're going to jump into is hand railings. We're going to apply them to the left-hand side here. We're going to apply them to the right-hand side here. But I'm going to take a little break from painting to sketch it out on my canvas first before actually committing to the paint, because this is something that's going to require a lot of perspective. It is something that's going to require a lot of detail and thought. So I'm going to make sure that it's proportioned right initially, and that I'll draw it on, and then you and I will get right back to painting it. But with that, before we jump into it, I would like to note that we've incorporated some human-made structure in this thus far with the stairs here, and that is a little complicated because it does involve perspective, it does involve this detail work, but what we're about to do involves a whole lot more. So if you do find that you struggle with perspective or just with the drawing process in general, again, I do have the traceable up over on Patreon to help you with that. And on the note of Patreon and all of that, I'd like to take a minute to just say thank you to all of our patrons. Without you, this couldn't happen. This channel is fan-funded. It is fan-funded up on Patreon. Without the great supporters up there, none of this, honestly, none of this could happen. So thank you to everyone who does make this a thing. I love that I get to teach these lessons. I love that I get to expose people to new information that they might not have been able to get. I personally went to university for fine art, and that was quite expensive, and not everybody gets that opportunity. So I really appreciate that you give me the vehicle to go out and teach this and bring this information to others, and that we're able to build a community where we do share our work. And you know, it's this great thing. I'm very grateful for it, and I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who does support the channel. If you too would like to support the channel, there will be a link to Patreon in the description. Up there we do have the traceable, a bunch of bonus lessons, extended lessons, all of my ebooks, access to our private Facebook group for all of the patrons to kind of share their work and whatnot. But with that, we should get back into this. Sorry, I know that was a little bit long, a little loquacious, but you know, when you start thinking about it, when you start talking about it, you feel so grateful for the amazing people in your life who support you and make it possible for you to do the things you do. And I truly thank everyone who supports the channel in all the ways that they do. Even if you're not supporting up on Patreon, if you're just liking the videos and sharing them, doing things like that, it means a lot too. So thank you to everyone. My little rant is over here. Let's get back into the drawing and then back into the painting. I'll see you in just a second. So as you can see, I took a little break and drew in all of our wooden posts here, and I'm going to continue working with the smaller flat-headed brush, and I'm going to make sure that it's nice and wet. You can see the bristles right now, they're very condensed, And that means that I'm going to get a very sharp, clean line. Now for this, we'll mix a similar color to what we used for the base layer of the brown. So I start with a lot of Mars Black, good amount of burnt umber, just a little bit of titanium white, don't want too much. And I think that'll be a good base layer right there. See that? And I'm going to start by working on the left hand side because it's closer to where I am sitting wise and it'll be easier to paint. I want to start with the side that will be easier. That way I can get a good strong start and do everything I'm going to do with confidence. That way when we move over to the slightly harder side, I'll be able to say, you know what, we did this, this is what we learned, and I'll also feel a little bit warmed up as well. So I did that vertical post. Now I'm doing the slanted one. Because we're applying this very dark pigment next to the dark greens, it will visually get lost for a minute, but when we go back in and add those highlights, we'll really get to see it again. So don't worry about that. There we go. Now I did the drawing that you see here with a white colored pencil. It's a woodless colored pencil and it's erasable, which is great because I have a little bit of it down here at the bottom and I can actually take that out a little bit later on. So I don't have to follow it exactly. And that's important because I generally like to make my applications of trees, posts, really just about everything in painting slightly smaller than I think it needs to be, and then I slowly make it bigger over time because it's much easier to make something bigger than it is to make something smaller. So I start with that, and then I'll work my way down to the next post. You see that this is a step up, and then we move down, so the post here also needs to move down. And then we'll have that come to the bottom here. You're going to want this post to be smaller than this one because it's a little bit farther away. And they're progressively going to get smaller and smaller. So that's another reason you want your brush to be relatively damp. It'll make making those smaller impressions and strokes a lot easier. And if you accidentally make them too big back here, well, that's fine because again, we didn't make the ones in the foreground too big, so we can go and we can make these bigger should we need to. It's one of the main reasons we again start with something a bit more tapered and small. Now we're heading back up because there are stairs, but you won't see a dramatic climb because of the perspective. Using quite a bit of water here on my brush right now. There we go. Do another one, also climbing. It will overlap part of the stairs and it will visually get lost, but when we add in the highlight, you'll see it. And we're just going to continue working this edge, and then again, once it's done and we have our highlights incorporated, then we can go back and do the other side. Here you can see that my stroke's getting smaller and smaller, and we're progressively moving up. You're also going to want to make incredibly small little posts here, and you want them to get slowly closer and closer together, just because, again, perspective will make them look that way. Eventually you won't even be able to see them, and we're at that point where they're essentially just getting lost back there. But it's definitely a good start. Definitely added some structure to our painting. And looking at this in contrast with this and this, I do feel like that's a good size, and I feel like that's a good size. So now we're going to work back on these two and make them a little bit bigger. So I start by mixing up some more of my pigment. Mixing it on top of / beside our initial mixture. There we go. Make this a little bit bigger, a little bit wider. And this small brush here has such a sharp edge, really cuts along well. We'll make this a little bit bigger close to this, and then it'll get smaller as you move towards the other one. And these don't have to be perfect, because remember, it's wood, it's out in nature. What does need to be right is, I've said it 100 times, the perspective. There we go. Grab some more paint. Make this bigger. Probably make this bigger too. And this gets lost in between these blades of grass. Here I'm skipping a little area so this piece of grass can move over it. And then I'm applying it down below, like that. Thickening this just a little bit. And making sure we have a nice thick application. If you feel like any area is a little transparent, go back and give it another coat of paint. Here I'm just refining though. Okay, so next we can take our titanium white, our burnt umber, a little bit of our Mars black, create a bit of a highlight here. I'll test it on the wood to see how well it matches. It's good, it's a little bit bright. So we'll grab a hint more Mars black, not much, it's a very strong pigment, you won't need much. Mix that together, try it, and that looks better. So now we'll go to the top of our post because it's going to be receiving the most light. The light is shining down, reflecting down on it. I'm starting with the very top, and then I'll move my way down, but I'll do a little bit of a tap here and there. I'll do a little bit of a drag here and there. That way we get that same wood-like impression that we have down on this. And I'll slowly work it down until I run out of paint. And you want it to get darker and darker, more transparent as you do move down. There we go. It's a good start. Working the top, I have quite a bit of paint on my brush. So before I start moving down, I think I'm going to do another little area or two. And now I'll start working my way back down, letting that paint run out, applying very minimal amounts of pressure. And this area I want to come in with clean, sharp paint because we now have to apply it on top of a previously applied brown. So to really have it stand out and look sharp, make sure your brush is nice and damp. Grab new clean pigment. Look how sharp that is. It's exactly what we wanted. I'm grounding my hand with my pinky finger on the canvas to eliminate shake from my hand. And I'll just work this up a little bit, tap here and there, but I don't want to apply much pressure because it needs to get smaller and smaller. Now you have a couple options regarding the posts here. You could have these resting on top of posts, in which case we're just going to round this edge right here. And we'll round the other edge a little bit too. We'll leave a bit of a darker area in between the two. That way it looks like there's a bit of a shadow. Now, a lot of the light here is coming from the sky, so you could argue that it's kind of coming from all directions, but for the sake of this piece, we'll say that it's coming from the end of the path in the larger cluster of stars that we painted. So that means the light's coming this way, and that means this side of our posts is going to have a highlight, and this side is going to be a bit darker. So yet again, I'm going to mix more of this bright pigment that we have here. And we're going to need some Mars Black to tone that down. There we go. You can see the previous highlight pigment right beside it, so I can tell that that's a little bit too gray and a little bit too dark. So I'll make some minor adjustments. There we go. Now this is still a little bit darker than what I previously had, but I'm okay with that, because a little bit of this might be casting a shadow down on it. Here, you can see I'm applying on that right-hand side. And I'm doing so with a couple of little taps, that way we have a slight movement in the wood. It's a bit more interesting. Looks a bit more organic, natural. Now that I'm starting to run out of pigment, I'll work my way back. Give this a little bit of a rounded top. So that worked out well. Now we can continue, and I'm going to add another layer of highlights to this just so it has a little bit more depth. And with this, we're going to allow it to be slightly more saturated than what it previously was, and slightly brighter as well. So I'm mixing on top of my previous mixture so that I have that reference point. I know what I need it to be a little bit more heightened version of. So right there I have something that's a little bit more saturated. We'll throw in slightly more brown, and now we'll do a bit more titanium white. And we'll give this a shot. So I'm going back to this one, it's closest to us, it's going to be receiving the most saturation. Subjects are generally the most saturated and have the most innate color when they're closest to you, because they have less general reflective light. That isn't always the case. Sometimes there's something like a sunset and that can change those rules a little bit, but it's a good general rule. And I like this, but it could be a little bit brighter. So we'll get more titanium white, get more brown. We'll give this a try. There we go. That's what I wanted. This just added so much more depth to this post. It's a subtle detail, but it makes such a big difference. I feel like it actually already just added a lot of life to the painting. It's also a slightly brighter value than the grass that's right behind it, here especially, which makes it pop a bit more and look a little more distinct. I like that a lot. Yet again, we'll have to go down. Looking good. There we are. Doesn't that just really brighten it up? I might grab a hint of it and work it down into some of these boards as well. I don't want too much, and I want it to predominantly be here in the foreground, but I think just a little bit here and there can really help the painting. Now we're heading over to the right-hand side, which again is a little bit more tricky for me, just angling wise. But we have some practice now, so I can go into it confidently. Going to mix up that nice dark brown that we used for our base layer over here. I'm going to look for the drawings that I did. And I will start applying that pigment. Remember, we'll work our way in between some grass here, just to show some depth. I work on the sides first, and then I fill it in. Brush is relatively damp, so I can get these nice sharp impressions. So as you can see, I actually decided to change it up a little bit. I felt like the symmetry was making it a little too samey, so I added an extra post right here, which we did not have over here, and I hiked this up just a little bit higher, made it a little bit thicker. That way, it didn't feel like we were looking at the same thing, and the eye, when it looks at it, it kind of has to jump around. It has to assess what's happening. It's not saying, okay, I see one side, so I understand the other side, so I can move on. It's not a big difference, but it's enough to continue retaining interest. So from there, we're going to continue with our highlights. Same brush, make sure it's damp. We are grabbing our brown, titanium white, Mars black. Remember, we're going to do this in not one, but two sets of highlights. So don't make this first highlight too bright. And begin on the top with lots of little taps. We'll give the log a little bit of a round edge right here. And then we'll bring in those highlights from that edge. That way it doesn't look like we have an outline. We'll do lots of these little taps, connect some, leave some open. Let that pigment run out as we get farther and farther down the bottom. And you can see a vast difference between the highlights of this side and the highlights of this side. And that's exactly what we want, because we want to build them up in layers and stages. That way we have all of that extra depth showing through. Here I'm moving back, I'm getting the top, and then I'm moving down. And the issue we have over here, that we had over here initially, is that this value, while it's a brown, looks the same as this value, which is a green. They blend in really well together, and they don't really pop. So going in and doing that second highlight is important. With that, I'm now moving a bit farther away. My brush is accumulating a little bit more water than before. That way my strokes can be even sharper, but also more transparent, which we want because we want these highlights to get a little bit more subtle as you move into the back. Here I'm marking my way on top of our steps and our walkway. And now we are very far away, so we probably won't really even see this highlight, so just the softest touch right there. Then we'll need a bit more for the front of these. Applied in that same way, lots of little taps. This time we're applying it on the left-hand side, and we're working our way to the right. So opposite of what we did, rather, on the other side. And this is our new special post. Now we'll go back, mix a bit more of a highlight, make it a bit more saturated. And I have a lot of pigment on my brush, and if I want to apply this right now, I'd probably get a large application. So I'm going to wipe this off on a piece of paper towel, make sure my brush is damp. Now it's relatively clean. I'll grab some paint, but not half as much as what I had before. And now I can come in and deliver those nice, clean, sharp strokes. It's a good reminder in a lot of scenarios, if you just mixed your paint with the same brush you're going to use to apply a detail, you should probably wipe off that brush first and then go back in, grab some new paint, because in the mixing process you build up a lot of pigment farther up on your brush than you want, and it'll make creating details quite difficult. I feel like we haven't talked about that in a lesson in a long time, so hopefully it's useful for a number of you. There we go. Letting it run out as we move towards the back here. But of course we do need to come back in to these. This one's still a little bit wet, which is why you're not seeing that highlight really take to it. It's just kind of blending with that previous dark mixture. Whereas here, it's very bright and noticeable. Just applying the smallest amounts to the background here. Getting a little bit more water, getting a little bit more paint. I'll work this onto the other side just in case the color is a little bit different. That way, again, both sides are cohesive and they fit together. Looks like we are incredibly close though. We have quite the contrast on these, so they really stand out. You have those bright highlights, you have those really dark shadows underneath. So it makes this a great piece to draw on the eye. Work it that way and then up into the sky, which is exactly what we want. You might get a little bit of light reflecting on the other side. So when you're almost out, you can do that. So it is now the next day. I did take a little bit of a break from this because I stepped back, I looked at it and I asked myself, is there more you want to do in a beginner-friendly version? And the more I thought about it, the more I felt no. I really like to do a beginner-friendly version of these lessons. I like to do a more advanced version. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, definitely being a varied skill gap. But two, also, just because some people appreciate pieces in more of a minimalistic view and some appreciate things to be a bit more expansive. So I really try to make everybody happy with that, give people variety and option. And so I'm going to call this the beginner version. I'm going to continue it myself and do a more advanced, detailed, intricate version. I personally appreciate it when things are a bit more detailed, but I know not everybody does, and it is subjective, and I fully respect that. So I'm going to continue this up over on Patreon. I'll probably put another hour, maybe 2 hours into it, and I'll leave a link to that in the video description. But I really hope you feel like you've learned a lot in this lesson. It's been a while since we did a Starry Night Sky piece. I used to do a lot of 10-minute pieces. And with this one, I feel like we brought a lot of new ideas into it. The layering, the intricacy in the stars, I feel like that is so much better than anything we've ever done. And I also love the subtlety of it as well. So I'm very happy with this piece as is. I think that is a great, more minimal version of the painting. But again, I am going to expand up over on Patreon, which you can go and watch right now. You can follow the link in the description. And again, big thank you to everyone who does support the channel up over on Patreon. It is because of you that all of this happens, and it literally could not without your support. So truly thank you. And for those of you who are considering joining Patreon, not only do you get access to things like the advanced lessons like this, again, you also get the traceables. You can also get things like all 5 of my ebooks, which includes Acrylics for Beginners, the Essentials, teaches you everything you need to know about acrylic painting. You can also get 3 ebooks of traceables, up there. There's also things like our private Facebook group where we all kind of share our work, help each other out. It's a great way of just kind of sharing your artwork with me. And there are also personalized art reviews at higher tiers as well. So there is a bunch up there. I suppose I should also mention, for those of you who don't want to subscribe, you can also purchase the ebook separately on my Etsy. So that's an option. But, you know, I really appreciate everyone who does take the time to watch these, who does take the time to subscribe. It's an honor that I get to be in this space, that I get to make these videos and this art. And so with that, I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson next week, or in, you know, just a couple of minutes when you click the link in the description. So see you soon. Thank you for watching, and above all, as always, stay creative.